Sunday evening, October 13th, and I came back from Noboribetsu by train, and actually had a quick meeting right after that, and finally kind of done with the errands. Going back to the same hotel that I was staying just before. Basically, I'm gonna use probably a bit of this footage later on for some summary thoughts about the whole Sapporo stay, or maybe I'll actually add some dedicated footage maybe in the next couple of days. I still have a couple of days in Sapporo. I'll try to kind of put together a summary. Overall, the impressions of the city from the third visit, of the surrounding areas, the cost of living, cost of rentals, very important, and the overall vibe.
This video is for those who are planning a visit to Sapporo and to Hokkaido in general, particularly for a longer stay, possibly with a view to relocate for the mid-term, long-term. If you're planning just to visit briefly as part of a longer Japan tour, you might also find some of it interesting or relevant. We'll start with the context and the overall impressions, and then discuss the weather, language, food, transportation, and conclude with the cost of living. So, the context and the disclaimers. The impressions and the views in this video are mainly based on the 3-week stay in September, October this year, 2024, and the prices quoted reflect this period. It's also informed to an extent by earlier visits in December of 2022 and August/September 2023 last year. So a disclaimer is due. I do not live in Japan at this time and do not pretend to be an expert in Japan. This is entirely an outsider's view. I have, however, visited Japan, mostly Tokyo, on several occasions in the past, mostly for work, but also for friendly visits. And that also informs this video to some extent. My other background in Asia is that I lived and worked in Singapore, in Taiwan for about 8 years now, all in all. And I also occasionally spend my winters in Thailand. So that's my reference grid and comparison basis. Of course, I will inevitably be wrong in some aspects. Possibly the entire video will turn out to have been wrong in everything, but that's just the nature of limited time and information. So if something is proven completely wrong, I might update it in the future. Actually, I will update this anyways, but more on that later. Overall impressions are mostly either positive or very positive. It's mild weather, overall very safe, feels very safe at least, good public transport, overall great infrastructure, reasonable cost for most things, lots to do and to see around the area, relatively few tourists compared to other cities, especially compared to Tokyo. And most of the foreigners that I saw were either South Koreans or Chinese, mainly Chinese, with a fair bit of maybe Taiwanese, Thai. Surprisingly, I didn't see that many European or North American tourists. And most of the tourists, they tended to congregate around Odori, Tanokikoji, Susukino, these touristic spots for most of the time. However, in most of the other areas, I think I was basically the only foreigner for 99% of the time. Number one, the weather. I'll update this section following a longer winter stay, maybe next year, because otherwise it would be incomplete. It is incomplete. First, my brief stay in December 2 years ago wasn't that representative. I was only in for a couple of days, for 3 or 4 days. And it's already fading in memory. December isn't actually the coldest or the snowiest month. Usually January is. So, and secondly, year-on-year weather can no longer be relied upon. Every year is a bit different these days. So I will update this weather section following a longer winter stay. Now, summer weather. The longer visit last summer actually saw the hottest temperatures on record. I think it reached 36 degrees Celsius in Sapporo, and between the concrete buildings it actually felt quite a bit hotter than that, possibly in the low 40s. The good thing, however, was that it was a lot less humid than in Singapore, Taipei, Bangkok, or even Chiang Mai in the summer. So it was a lot less uncomfortable. I felt actually quite a bit of relief coming in from Taipei, which is almost unbearable in August, July, August. So that's a plus side. The downside is that there's very little or not at all air conditioning in most apartments in Hokkaido, including in Sapporo, aside from hotels and newer condos. So most hotels will have some air conditioning, but most condos, they don't have it. Maybe just the new ones, or the ones where the owners installed just recently. Just like in British Columbia, in Canada, in Vancouver, since there wasn't really a summer heat wave issue before until a few years ago, people didn't really worry much about cooling their premises. So the emphasis has always been on heating and insulation, and most homes have pretty impressive insulation. They have double glazed windows. And oil heaters, electric heaters maybe, sometimes really powerful oil heaters, but no air conditioning. So if you're living in a place like that, it can get really hot. And I actually remember last year when I went in Niseko, I was staying in a town called Kuchan. The hotel I was staying there, it had some air conditioning in the common areas, like the lobby, and I think, some kind of common areas. But the rooms itself, themselves, didn't have air cons, and it was, I would say, almost 40 in the daytime and about 35 at night, and it was quite hot. So, yeah. In recent years, however, there's been a trend towards some air conditioning in Sapporo, at least, maybe less so in the countryside. So I think some landlords, apartment owners started installing them. But I would say, based on me just looking at the balconies, at the windows, I would say only about 5% have it. 5% of the apartments have it. Maybe more so, 10 to 20% among the individual homes. And some apartments, it's actually not very easy to install air conditioning because basically the buildings are not really designed for it. Sometimes they won't even have a balcony. So, and maybe I would say sometimes the buildings won't have the power infrastructure in place. The transformer might not be enough. So it is a bit of a complication. Private homes, however, this is a lot easier to do. So the trend is more noticeable. And what I noticed is that oftentimes the owners will simply install the compressor outside, not even on the wall, but just bolt it onto the concrete on the ground. So overall, and if you can't do, or you don't have the time or the funds to do the proper installation, what some people do in an emergency, like if their main aircon has failed or something else happened. They will put in these rather inefficient mobile air cons in the summer. I've seen that happen quite a few times in August, and yeah, it's very wasteful. They're not very efficient. Actually, they're really inefficient. But that's what they do in a pinch, because you can't have like elderly people dying from heat exhaustion and stuff like that. So overall, though, I think given that winters are, I would say, cautiously fairly mild compared to Canadian winters or Siberian winters, Hokkaido might be fairly conducive to heat pumps. But myself, I haven't seen anyone doing it. But if they do, I think it would be pretty good use of the infrastructure, of the materials and the building, because it can do both heating and cooling and is much more energy efficient. So now into the fall temperatures. I was around for most of late September through mid-October, and it was generally around 15 to 20 degrees throughout my stay with very little rain, and it was very comfortable. I never had to use aircon, even though my hotel had one. I basically never turned it on, and I was generally able to get around outside in a single layer and a t-shirt for like 80% of the time, adding maybe one layer or a windbreaker in the evening. So it was absolutely adequate and very comfortable.
Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. 20 degrees. 5 o'clock almost. In the middle of October. This is not normal.
As soon as I left, though, temperatures dropped quite sharply, down to 7 degrees by October 20. So I would say people have to layer up. Starting from mid-November, you definitely have to layer up, and proper winter gear will be needed from December onwards, especially if heading outside the city to the countryside. So you definitely need some proper winter gear and gloves and winter hat and all that kind of stuff. Footwear wise, this time I didn't require anything special, and even on the December trip I didn't need anything cold weather, because it wasn't that cold, even though I went kind of stumbling around in the snow in Miyanosawa area, where the chocolate factory is. Yeah. And I didn't have much problem with the snow, but I do recall tripping and slipping around in my walking shoes around Odori, because it got pretty icy, black ice on the sidewalks. So I think if you're coming in December, January, at least you're going to need some good hiking shoes with good treads, and possibly with the removable spike bands, rubber spike bands. That will do the job in most of the situations in the city. If you're heading out into the snow in the countryside, you will need snow boots and proper winter gear. Now, language. Unless you're just visiting for a few days, you'll probably need a certain level of survival Japanese to function in the country and get your daily stuff done, daily, monthly, weekly things. And that is true for Hokkaido as well. Google Translate works okay, relatively okay. Google Lens helps with the menus and street signs, but they won't do everything for you. Eventually you'll have to speak, and I think most people end up having to learn, and I think I'm seeing more and more foreigners actually speaking some pretty decent Japanese. certainly way more than like 10 years ago. My own Japanese is very rudimentary. For some reason, it's a bit easier for me than Chinese or Thai, for instance. And I managed to maintain some basic survival level of it just by listening to some YouTube podcasts. I think Leila's bite-sized Japanese is great, and Kanami is also pretty good. What else is important? Well, food. Why do people come to Hokkaido for food? Food is mostly Japanese, so if you can't eat Japanese food, don't come to Japan. Alright, just kidding. There's a fairly wide range of choices in ramen, especially in the spicy miso ramen subcategory, and it's generally around 900 yen per bowl, which is kind of, for me at least, it's the mid-market reference point for eating out. So let's say you get a bowl of ramen for 900, and there's a beer for 500, 600. So that will be around 1500 yen. So that's kind of the reference range from 1000 to 1500 yen. Anything above will be, to me at least, I would think it's a bit expensive. And of course, you can get something quick at the convenience store for about 600 or 800 yen. But maybe you don't want to do that in the long run. So somewhere around 1,500 yen will be the eating out kind of ballpark. Overall, Hokkaido, I think, is a great place for food industry, F&B, and that's largely because it has a really developed and diverse agriculture. And there's something in particular that I find appealing. Unlike most places in Asia where you can't get good bread or good cheese, in Hokkaido you can easily get pretty good crusty bread, good butter, and good cheese, at least decent cheese. Maybe it's not like French, but it's fairly decent. And in my case, I went with the daily bakeries and the Koko no Susukino, and the prices were quite reasonable, a lot cheaper than in Taipei or in Singapore for comparable quality of bread. I think that's because most of the ingredients, the dairies, the wheat are grown right here in Hokkaido. The butter was especially so good and so real. I actually even wanted to pack it with me, but yeah, I think that would be going overboard. Other Asian food, like Indian food, will be more expensive. That's just the nature of the F&B industry. With always the exception of Vietnamese food, it's always somehow the best deal anywhere you go. Yeah, somehow they manage to get the cost right. What else? F&B. Tap beer is really good in Sapporo. I think it's basically down to it being super fresh. You are never more than a couple of weeks, maybe even a week away from actual brewing. There are some local brews, and Sapporo Classic is only sold within the prefecture, plus any number of local craft breweries that don't sell too far. For the most part, I went with just the standard Sapporo Draft or the Gold Star, and they were great out on the tap. I had to even impose a temporary beer moratorium till the end of the year because I just had way too much of it in Sapporo. So that's a plus. I would say in that regard, it's kind of like going to Dublin, I guess. Now on to transportation. Overall, the transport situation is pretty good. I kept referring to it as MRT in the other videos, but it's actually called the Sapporo Municipal Subway for short, Chikatetsu in Japanese. And there are only 3 lines, but they cover most of the residential areas and commercial hubs. So most people don't really have to drive, don't really need a car. really depends on like your family situation or nature of your job. But 99% of the time, it's not that critical. You don't need a car. The subway is not as new. It's actually fairly old, maybe early 80s, it feels. And maybe it's not as advanced like in some other cities, but it's there. It's quite convenient, very clean. The rides are affordable, generally around 210 to 250, generally around 240 yen per ride. So overall, I quite liked it. I also found it a lot quieter than most rapid transit systems that I've seen in other cities like Tokyo, Singapore, Taipei, Hong Kong, Bangkok, you name it. And that's because the wheels are actually, they have rubber tires on them, much like normal bus wheels. So basically, it's almost like Sapporo MRT is a bunch of buses connected on a train. Very soft riding. One kind of annoying quirk of the Sapporo system is that oftentimes the exit or entrance rather leads to only one side of the tracks. There's no way to cross underground, so you have to get out and find the proper entrance. I think I might have had that experience in some Tokyo stations, but generally it's quite rare. At least I never had that in Singapore or in Taipei. Other than the Chikatetsu, the subway, it seems that the other main mode of transportation is the bicycle, either the rental one, but I think most people have their own bikes. The rental bikes are not as prevalent as in Taipei or in Singapore. It seemed to me that pretty much everybody had a bike of some kind, either a traditional vintage bike or lady bike, or the electrically assisted mama bike with additional seats for children, or more recently the flat wheel bikes, probably due to the icy conditions in maybe late October, early November. And I think for most regular bikes, just normal bike, the season is at least from March through October, so you get at least 8 months. As for the buses, I've never used them, so I can't speak about it. There's a bus company called Chuo Bus, and I've seen them all over the place, all over the island. So, but I have never used them myself. The Roman Densha, the streetcar, it's cute, it looks good, very vintage. There's some really modern ones. As for utility, I think it's a bit limited because it travels literally in a closed circle through Odori, Nishi Odori, Minami, kind of scraping by Susukino. Basically just the southwestern section of downtown Sapporo, and it's all walkable, so actually you don't really need it as much unless you're going from the very far south end of it to Odori and the other way around. That's the only, I think, use case as far as I can see. But it's there and it's affordable, like 200 yen a ride, so it's good to have. What else? Sapporo is great not only for cycling but also for jogging. There are plenty of parks everywhere in the city. Some are just neighborhood parks, or the university campuses like the Sapporo University. There's a Sapporo City one and the University of Hokkaido. And some parks are actually like real forest, like the Makamanai Park in the south. And the weather, even in the heat of August, the weather was fairly conducive for running. I thought because the temperature would drop quite noticeably around 6 o'clock. So even if it's real hot in the daytime, 30, 36, by the evening it drops to almost 25 and you're good for a run. So other than that, there's a whole lineup of the museums. I won't go into that. Let's just say I went to the beer museum last time. This time I didn't have time for it. But there's so many other museums and galleries and such. Many other places to see. And within a day trip, there's even more stuff. And I think there's actually way more stuff that you can fit in a couple of days around Sapporo. So allow at least a couple of days for the city and a few more days for getting around. And if your time budget is really tight, okay, there is Otaru. And if you have the time and the funds, certainly do the Niseko, possibly Naboribetsu, Furano, Asahikawa, etc., etc. Okay, now let's get to the meat of it. The detailed cost of living. Living as a traveler, so not as a local resident. So each day on this trip, I wrote down the amount spent in 6 major categories: breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, transit, and miscellaneous. The amounts varied throughout the whole stay, and often there was very little for breakfast or nothing, because I would manage with the supplies purchased the day before. But overall, they kind of average to some average numbers for these 6 categories. And the total came to about maybe just shy of 4,000 yen per day. And this is not a made-up number or online research or somebody telling you this. This is just me taking note of every single spend every single day of the trip. So that gives you the average daily spend, 4,000 yen per day, and you can work out the monthly budget by multiplying the number by 30. That's about 120,000 yen per month for 3 meals a day, coffee or snack, a transit, and some miscellaneous expenses like getting a t-shirt, something like that. The implication for the actual living expenses as a resident is that they will tend to be somewhat lower than while traveling. In my experience, that varies depending on the country. So maybe from drops by 10 to 20% for the lower cost countries like Thailand, for instance, and maybe by almost 30% for the more expensive ones. And why it drops is because if you're staying for the long term, you figure out where things are a bit cheaper, or you don't have to eat out as much. You can actually go at home. And I'll just be conservative and say that you'll probably manage to live at least 10% lower than while traveling, and likely manage to keep just around 110 maybe yen a month. That is excluding the rent, the utilities, medical insurance, contingency for emergency expenses like a laptop suddenly dying on you, or maybe like losing a cell phone, God forbid. So such contingencies can run anywhere from 20 to 100 of your normal daily expenses. So you have to make your own decision about that. Like if you want to be totally conservative, you can literally double. If you are being aggressive, and people sometimes are, they just add maybe 20-30% to their normal daily expenses. But it's crucial to add some contingency. You don't want to run way too lean. Also note that if you're digging in for more than 180 days, you're no longer a tourist. You'll have to pay the 10% consumption tax on most purchases like clothing and gadgetry that you will use in Japan. They actually give you a piece of paper that says you cannot open this item while in Japan. So you can use it after you left the country. Overall, with the basic rent, which is somewhere in the region from 30 to 50 yen a month. Check my other video on the locations and the rates. Plus the utilities and medical, it will probably add up to about 200,000 yen a month, which is ironically what most people earn. Maybe a bit less for the very entry jobs. Maybe, like for instance, Lela in her podcast was referring to a daughter of her friends who was earning 150 after deductions, 150,000 yen a month. Yeah, that is quite tight. So I think income levels, although quite realistic for getting by, they're not that spectacular, especially with the yen being historically weak. So, which is why we don't see that many Japanese tourists anymore, like in the 80s, maybe early 90s. So, another thing regarding the cost is that travel by train, although generally a lot less costly in most places than air travel and far less carbon intensive, can be quite expensive in Japan. So it's kind of, I think, one area where people will feel the inflation most acutely. So JR price hikes will be widely reported and widely discussed and widely decried. Certainly it's more expensive than in Taiwan, where it's also quite a topic, and especially more expensive than in Thailand. So the Shinkansen journey on the Hayabusa train from Tokyo to Hakodate, and then the Hokkaido Express to Sapporo, all together cost me a lot more. I think it cost me about 250 Singapore, which was way more than the return flight by ANA Airdo back to Tokyo in December, which only cost me about 100 Singapore. I think that was the low season for them. And yeah, so, and this recent trip to Inabori-Betsu, 3 hours total, there and back, cost about 9,800 yen, which is about twice the cost of a similar duration journey in Taiwan, and possibly 3 or 4 times of the Bangkok to Chiang Mai sleeper train, second class, which is about 10 hours. So do your math. Basically, it costs a lot more than in other Asian countries, but probably still cheaper than UK trains, ironically. So if you want to stay on the budget, check the train fares and plan accordingly. Possibly rent a car for the local trips for many stops, getting around. And getting around by train, especially going to the main island, will cost you a lot. Locals usually go to Tokyo by Airdo or the other budget airline, Peach. They try to do so in the low seasons, as the fares fluctuate quite a lot. So, what's the summary and conclusion? We had some brief observations and impressions on several aspects of visiting Sapporo and possibly staying for the short to mid-term. Hopefully some of it was interesting and informative. As for me, I really enjoyed the stay in September, October 2024, and almost didn't want to leave. I will definitely be coming back either for the springtime or for a longer wintertime visit, at which point I might update this overview. Thanks for watching.